Right, so Benjamin Netanyahu is a pretty desperate man right now. The ceasefire in Lebanon is over, yet he is still there. The Gaza ceasefire is still holding and hostage exchanges are continuing as he ends up under more and more pressure to collapse that ceasefire and not implement phase 2, which would see his government collapse and him dumped out of power. He has extended his atrocities to the West Bank since then, of course, especially areas such as Jenin and Tulkarem, to make up for the ending of the hostilities at the present time in Gaza. But without Hamas being present there, it hasn't quite had the same ring and the same support globally that he would like, and when settler eyes are still on Gaza as the prize, atrocities there just aren't going to cut it. So an attack on 3 buses in Tel Aviv, devices being planted on them, well, that had all the trimmings of a proper terror attack, didn't it? And could be the sort of miracle Netanyahu wanted to save himself from his own side, the sort of thing that would pass for a miracle in his fevered mind. The trouble is this incident has been dug into more and more. Evidence, such as it is, has increasingly pointed to this being an Israeli orchestrated miracle. So could Netanyahu be behind it himself? And doesn't it say a lot about him that as we assemble the facts, as we know them in relation to this incident, that it is so believable that he could be behind it? And if that could be proven, well, his desperation could have led him to make a fatal mistake. Right, so the recent bus attacks in Tel Aviv. Who is actually responsible for them then? Because Israel are being weirdly cagey about it. And not just because it is a couple of Israelis that have been picked up for it, I fancy, but because Israel won't tell us anything about them, who they are, who they may be affiliated to, and what their reasoning for these attacks might be. Sort of generating a lot of suspicion that this might have been orchestrated from higher up on their side. And there is certainly a lot of reason to think that, despite being a heavy accusation too, which I will get into. But how high up could it go? Because the timing of the attack could not have been more convenient for Benjamin Netanyahu, a man in need of an absolute miracle right now, as his attacks on neighbouring states and territories tell a tale of repeated military failure from Gaza to Lebanon and beyond, which has placed him under massive internal pressures as Israeli ministers, themselves getting it in the neck from those they represent, demand a win here, demand some results. And a whole new investigation, a whole new attack, seemingly coming from nowhere, well, releases that pressure on him a little bit so he can focus on what could be an all-new threat. Increasingly, the evidence suggests that this may have been a false flag operation, orchestrated to further Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's political agenda against Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. So first off, what exactly happened then, if you haven't heard of this story or haven't read much about it? Well, on February the 20th, 3 buses in Tel Aviv were targeted in bombings that left absolutely nobody hurt, not even slightly injured. Immediately, Netanyahu condemned the attack. Of course he would, calling it an act of terrorism and vowing a swift and forceful response. Within hours, he ordered a massive counter-terror operation in the West Bank, deploying troops and conducting raids that resulted in the arrests of dozens of Palestinians, all very conveniently, just as the operations in the West Bank under Operation Iron Wall was coming to an end. That's very convenient. It's far from the only coincidence here, though, which is raising all the more suspicion. Despite Netanyahu's quick finger-pointing at Palestinian groups, no organisation has claimed responsibility for this attack. And that's unusual, because usually when something like this happens, it is for a reason, and generally those responsible are more than prepared to say, this was us, this is why we did it. None of that has happened. Even more telling, Israeli authorities have arrested 2 Israelis in connection with the bombings, not Palestinians, despite Netanyahu's actions and claims, and yet their identities remain shrouded in secrecy as well, begging the question, what is the Israeli government hiding here? So let's expose this all a little bit more deeply, because what we have here is the very opposite of Lemony Snicket's series of unfortunate events, and have instead got Benjamin Netanyahu's series of incredibly fortunate miracles. You see, shortly before 8:30 p.m. on Thursday night in Tel Aviv, 2 buses, parked well away from each other, and well away from other buses, exploded in a parking lot with absolutely nobody around. Shortly after that, another bus, not very far away, also exploded after a passenger notified the driver of a device they had found there, at which point the bus was evacuated, and as soon as everyone was safely away from the buses, it too exploded. 2 other devices were allegedly found on buses elsewhere as well, and these were apparently neutralised without going off. Now, the claims that have come from Israeli authorities is that these bombs went off 12 hours early, and that is why they went off with nobody around. The timers had apparently been incorrectly set. Yet the 2 buses in the parking lot were well away from all other buses, avoiding all collateral damage therefore, and the other device on the other bus only went off after all passengers moved away, and went off slightly later than the devices on those other 2 buses. So if this is a coordinated terror attack of some sort, surely they would have all been meant to go off at the same time. Adding further fuel to the fire is the writing on the devices that were neutralized that didn't go off. They were all written in Arabic, despite 2 Israelis being arrested in connection to these attacks. And bearing in mind the writing was apparently full of spelling and grammar mistakes too, so unless the most illiterate of terrorists were sent to plant these devices, it looks suspiciously like an Israeli attempt to make it look like a Palestinian attack. Also, if these were intended to actually explode, why write clues on them? Who is Israel blaming for all of this then? Iran, as it happens. It was a very sophisticated operation, we're being told, and therefore it cannot have been anyone else. Such capability is not in the power of those dissident forces in the West Bank, so Israel tells us. And the reason behind their thinking here centres around a statement by the Qassam Brigade's Tulkarm branch, saying that the revenge of the martyrs will not be forgotten as long as the occupier is present on our land. And this has been interpreted by some in Israel as claiming responsibility for these bus attacks, but that's a little bit vague, isn't it? Wouldn't you just come out and say it straight? Hamas, however, stated that it wasn't them, but that it was probably Israel itself behind it, as this excerpt from the Cradle explains. Responding to the accusations, Bassem Naim, a leading member of the Hamas Politburo, told the Cradle the following. Based on the timing and the way in which it happened, the first possibility for me is that Netanyahu or members of his government escaped from their obligations in the ceasefire agreement and created an external enemy to relieve the increasing internal pressure. Anyone who reads the history of the Zionist movement will find dozens of proven events that were planned and executed by Zionist elements against Jews themselves. Lending credit to the allegations of the Hamas official are the apparent issues with the coordination of the bombings. The armed groups inside the West Bank have not proven themselves capable of pulling off these kinds of attacks before, showing minimal military sophistication. On the other hand, by Israel's own admission, this was a well-planned operation that evaded detection by the Israeli army and Shin Bet, hence the blame being placed on Tehran. On top of all of that, Israeli officials have been unusually tight-lipped about this investigation. The 2 Israelis arrested have not been named, and no details about their motives or affiliations have been released. Why not? Normally they can't stop falling over themselves to release details, to let people know that they're getting on top of this, and we know exactly who's to blame, and this is what we're going to do about it, and all that sort of thing. This lack of transparency is raising eyebrows, therefore, understandably, especially given Netanyahu's history of using security incidents to advance his political agenda, and he's very much done that again this time around as well. Because in what was a blatant media stunt, Netanyahu gave one of his 3 public addresses on Friday from inside a Palestinian family's home in Tulkarm. Israeli forces forced the Palestinian family out of their home, threw them out of their own house, took it over as a military position, and from there Netanyahu stated that we are entering the terrorist strongholds, clearing entire streets used by terrorists, their homes, we are eliminating terrorists and commanders. No, you aren't. You just threw a family out on the street so you could use their home for a presser. With Netanyahu facing mounting pressure both domestically and internationally over his government's treatment of Palestinians, the failure to gain any semblance of success for all of the atrocity he has already committed and is still being committed, well, Netanyahu needed a miracle. And it's pretty easy to see on the face of it how all of these coincidences together might have been manufacturing such a miracle here. His approval ratings are slipping. His coalition is very fragile. What better way to rally support than to manufacture a new crisis that paints him as the strongman protecting Israel from terrorists? Netanyahu has long used the spectre of terrorism to justify his aggressive policies in the West Bank and Gaza, and this is just another one. So easy to see that, so easy to believe that. Settlements continue to expand, Palestinian homes are demolished, and military raids are a daily occurrence. The Tel Aviv bombings provided the perfect pretext to escalate these actions, keep them going, and keep the political wolf from Netanyahu's door for the moment at least. But if this was indeed a false flag operation, it means Netanyahu has willingly risked the lives of his own people to further his agenda and keep himself in post. And the sad fact is, it is really easy to believe this monster of a man would do this. That's how desperate he is, and that's how dangerous he is, and how dangerous the situation has become. And it's only going to worsen the more uncertain his political future becomes. Ultimately, the only logical conclusion that can be drawn from this right now is that this incident has been part of the ongoing broader strategy Israel used to dehumanize Palestinians, paint them all as terrorists and monsters, and justify their oppression accordingly. By framing every act of violence as terrorism, by making that the go-to response, Netanyahu deflects attention from the root causes of the conflict, which are his occupation of Palestine, his displacement of Palestinians, and the systemic inequality he presides over and celebrates as the illegal occupier of the state of Palestine. The Tel Aviv bombings, whether orchestrated or exploited, are being used to perpetuate a cycle of violence that benefits no one except Netanyahu. And isn't that such a convenience? So what do you think? Do you reckon the Tel Aviv bus bombings are a false flag operation? Or is this just another tragic chapter in a decades-long conflict? And who else do you think might be to blame? Do let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Meanwhile, in another likely sign of further desperation on Netanyahu's behalf, the returned remains of the Bibas family led to a mistake when the body of the mother Cherie Bibas was not the body Israel received. But as they went quickly on the offensive to say Hamas did that on purpose, hypocrisy on steroids given Israel's actions on that score, the Red Cross weighed in on this matter and they've given Netanyahu short shrift for it. Of all places for him to get a beasting from, you wouldn't have figured it being them necessarily, would you? Well, there you go. Get all the details of that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe before you do so, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as supporting the channel as well, which is very much appreciated as ever. And I will hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.